Long day. Longer tomorrow, I reckon.
Sergeant, ensure the rotation is correct on these. I want the older stock moved out first. And check those seals.
Rough night.
Yeah. At least the milk's warm.
Try and drink this. It'll help you regain your strength.
Much obliged.
January 1943. Before dawn, the Atlantic is restless. Gray waves strike the hulls of American transport ships, pushing east, their decks crowded with young men, wrapped in wool and silence. Below, in narrow mess compartments, steam rises from metal cups. The liquid inside is pale, warm, faintly sweet. Milk. Far from the gunfire, far from the maps marked in red and blue, soldiers drink quietly. Some have crossed an ocean for the first time. Others are already weakened by cold, fatigue, and weeks of rationed food. Outside, the war waits, North Africa, Sicily, Italy. Inside their bodies, another battle has already begun. In 1943, the United States is racing against time. Millions of men must not only reach the front, but arrive strong enough to fight, march, heal, and survive. Rifles and tanks are useless if soldiers collapse before contact with the enemy. Disease, fractures, exhaustion, and malnutrition have destroyed armies before a single shot was fired. So planners look beyond weapons. They study bones, muscles, blood. They look at something ordinary and turn it into strategy. Because before America could defeat Nazi Germany on the battlefield, it first had to solve a quieter problem: how to keep its soldiers alive long enough to win the war. By the opening weeks of 1943, the Second World War had entered a brutal phase of reckoning. The illusion of a short, decisive conflict was long gone. Across Europe and North Africa, the war had become one of attrition, measured not only in territory gained or lost, but in bodies broken by cold, hunger, disease, and exhaustion. Nazi Germany still held most of continental Europe. The Wehrmacht, though strained, remained lethal. German divisions were dug in across Tunisia. Italy loomed ahead, and the Atlantic still swallowed Allied ships with frightening regularity. On the Eastern Front, the Battle of Stalingrad was grinding toward its conclusion, consuming men faster than factories could replace them. Victory would not come quickly. It would come to the side that could endure longest. For the United States, endurance was the problem. America had entered the war with industrial power unmatched in history, but an army still learning how to fight overseas. Between 1940 and 1943, the U.S. military expanded at a pace never before attempted. From fewer than 200,000 soldiers before the war, the Army swelled to over 8 million men by 1943. Training camps appeared almost overnight across the country. Rail lines, ports, and depots strained under the weight of mobilization. Yet beneath the spectacle of uniforms and parades, the Army faced a dangerous reality. Many recruits arrived undernourished by modern military standards. The Great Depression had left its mark. Medical examinations revealed high rates of dental problems, bone weakness, anemia, and vitamin deficiencies. In some draft boards, nearly 1 in 3 men failed initial physical exams. This was not a new lesson. The U.S. Army remembered World War I all too well. During that conflict, disease had incapacitated more soldiers than enemy fire. Influenza, pneumonia, dysentery, and malnutrition had quietly ravaged units before they reached the front. Marching armies burned calories faster than rations replaced them. Fractures and infections lingered longer than expected. Recovery was slow. Morale suffered. By 1943, American military planners understood that modern war punished the human body relentlessly. Soldiers marched long distances carrying heavy loads. They fought in heat and cold, often with little sleep. Bones absorbed repeated impact. Muscles tore and rebuilt. Immune systems were tested by foreign climates and unfamiliar pathogens. If the body failed, the unit failed. And failure was not an abstract concept. In North Africa during Operation Torch in late 1942, U.S. forces encountered hard lessons. While combat performance improved rapidly, non-combat casualties, illness, fatigue, nutritional collapse remained stubbornly high. Medical officers reported alarming numbers of stress fractures, gastrointestinal disorders, and delayed wound healing. Men were being pulled from a line not by bullets, but by breakdown. The enemy did not need to fire. Time and deprivation did the work. This forced a shift in thinking. The battlefield was no longer just terrain and firepower. It was metabolic, physiological, a contest between supply systems and human limits. If the United States hoped to defeat Nazi Germany in 1943 and beyond, it would have to wage war not only against the enemy, but against the slow erosion of its own soldiers. And that realization pushed planners toward a question rarely asked in war councils. What exactly should a modern army eat to survive a modern war? Once the question was asked, the answer demanded an entirely new kind of military planning. Food was no longer just sustenance. It became a system, measured, tested, standardized, and enforced with the same discipline as weapons procurement or troop movements. The responsibility fell largely to two institutions that rarely captured headlines: the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps and the Office of the Surgeon General. Together, they formed an uneasy but necessary partnership. The Quartermaster Corps controlled supply, what could be produced, stored, shipped, and delivered across oceans. The Surgeon General's office focused on the body, what nutrients soldiers needed to remain effective under sustained combat stress. By 1943, both sides were aligned by necessity. Scientific understanding of nutrition had advanced rapidly in the interwar years. Vitamins have been identified. Deficiency diseases like rickets, scurvy, and pellagra were now understood not as mysteries, but as failures of diet. American universities, agricultural schools, and medical institutions had spent decades studying protein intake, calcium absorption, and energy metabolism. For the first time, the U.S. military could translate laboratory science directly into battlefield policy. Milk stood at the center of that translation. In civilian America, milk had long been promoted as a cornerstone of health. By the 1930s, federal programs encouraged dairy consumption to combat childhood malnutrition during the Depression. The science was clear. Milk provided high-quality protein, essential fats, calcium, phosphorus, and vitamins A and D, nutrients directly linked to bone strength, muscle repair, nerve function, and immune resistance. For the Army, those benefits were not theoretical. Medical reports tied calcium intake to lower rates of stress fractures among marching troops. Protein was essential for wound healing and muscle recovery. Vitamin D deficiency had been linked to fatigue and skeletal weakness, especially in soldiers training indoors or deployed to northern latitudes. But fresh milk posed a logistical nightmare. It spoiled quickly. It required refrigeration. It was heavy. In the deserts of North Africa or the holds of transatlantic convoys, fresh milk was a luxury few armies could sustain. German forces, already facing fuel shortages and Allied bombing of rail networks, increasingly relied on thin, inadequate substitutes. Their rations deteriorated as the war dragged on. The American response was industrial. Powdered milk, dehydrated, shelf-stable, compact, became a solution. Advances in spray-drying technology allowed milk to retain most of its nutritional value while drastically reducing weight and spoilage. By 1943, American factories were producing vast quantities of dried whole milk and non-fat milk powder specifically for military use. These were not ad hoc decisions. Rations were tested in controlled environments. Soldiers' weights, bone density, recovery times, and illness rates were monitored. The Army revised daily calorie requirements upward, recognizing the extraordinary physical demands of combat. Milk, in one form or another, became a standard component of mess hall meals, field kitchens, and hospital diets. Behind the scenes, American agriculture mobilized as thoroughly as its factories. Dairy farms received government support, guaranteed contracts, and prioritized transport. Rail lines moved powdered milk to ports. Ships carried it across U-boat-infested waters. Quartermasters tracked it with the same care as ammunition. This was war by spreadsheet and blood test. And by mid-1943, as American forces prepared for sustained operations against Nazi Germany's southern flank, the true value of this planning would begin to reveal itself. Not in speeches or headlines, but in how long soldiers stayed on their feet, how quickly they healed, and how rarely they had to be sent home. Those effects would be felt from the individual soldier outward, shaping the war through multiple intersecting angles. For the individual American soldier in 1943, the war was experienced first through the body. Long marches blistered feet and strained bones. Packs weighed upward of 60 pounds. Sleep came in fragments. Cold nights stiffened muscles. Desert heat drained fluids faster than they could be replaced. Under these conditions, nutrition was not comfort, it was survival. Medical officers observed that soldiers consuming sufficient dairy rations maintained body weight more consistently during extended operations. Calcium intake mattered. Stress fractures, particularly in the feet and lower legs, were a persistent problem in marching armies. Units receiving adequate milk-based nutrition showed lower fracture rates and faster recovery when injuries occurred. Bones held, muscles rebuilt. Equally important was energy stability. Milk provided not only protein, but fats and sugars that released energy gradually. Soldiers were less prone to sudden fatigue. In field reports, commanders noted fewer collapses during long movements and improved endurance during multi-day operations. These were not dramatic changes, but they were cumulative. A man who could march 1 mile farther without breaking was a man still in the fight. Morale followed physiology. Warm milk in a mess tent, even in powdered form, reminded soldiers of home. It soothed stomachs irritated by stress and unfamiliar rations. It was predictable in a war defined by uncertainty. That psychological steadiness mattered more than planners initially realized. Because war was not fought by numbers on paper, it was fought by bodies pushed to their limits. And the body, it turned out, responded measurably to what it was fed. Angle 2, medicine, recovery, and survival. In field hospitals stretching from Algiers to Sicily, American surgeons faced a constant challenge: keeping wounded men alive long enough to return them to duty, or at least send them home whole. Gunshot wounds and shrapnel injuries were obvious enemies, but infection, delayed healing, and nutritional collapse were quieter threats. Milk became a medical tool. Hospital diets emphasized high protein, calcium-rich foods for recovering soldiers. Powdered milk was reconstituted and served multiple times daily. Medical officers reported faster wound closure, improved bone healing, and fewer complications among patients receiving adequate dairy-based nutrition. These outcomes were carefully recorded. The data mattered. Calcium supported skeletal repair. Protein fueled tissue regeneration. Vitamins aided immune response. In practical terms, this meant fewer amputations due to infection, shorter hospital stays, higher rates of return to limited duty. Each recovered soldier represented months of training preserved. The Surgeon General's reports from 1943 reflect this shift. Nutrition was no longer auxiliary, it was therapeutic. In a war where medical evacuation across oceans consumed enormous resources, anything that reduced recovery time had strategic value. A soldier healed faster was not just a medical success. It was a logistical victory. Angle 3, the machinery of supply. None of this mattered without delivery. Powdered milk traveled thousands of miles before reaching a soldier's cup. It left American dairies in sealed tins, passed through warehouses, loaded onto cargo ships, and survived submarine-infested routes to North Africa and Europe. From ports, it moved by rail and truck to depots, then forward to field kitchens and hospitals. The system was precise. Quartermasters calculated daily consumption rates, adjusted for climate and troop density. Spoilage rates were tracked. Containers were redesigned for easier handling under fire. Powdered milk required water, another logistical challenge, but it was manageable. Wells, purification units, and water trucks became part of the same network. This supply chain was invisible to most soldiers, but its reliability had direct consequences. German forces increasingly suffered from inconsistent rations as Allied bombing disrupted rail lines and agriculture collapsed under labor shortages. American units, by contrast, ate predictably, even in forward areas. Consistency was power, and that power flowed through a spoonful of reconstituted milk as surely as through a rifle barrel. These three angles, human, medical, logistical, revealed only part of the picture. The impact of milk in 1943 extended further, shaping leadership decisions and exposing stark contrasts with the enemy's declining capacity. At the highest levels of American command in 1943, the war was being fought on charts and tables long before it reached the front lines. Generals and planners understood that no amount of tactical brilliance could compensate for a force physically unable to sustain operations. This awareness shaped decisions that rarely appeared in official communiques. Senior officers within the War Department approved nutrition standards with the same seriousness as weapon specifications. Daily ration requirements were revised upward to reflect real battlefield demands rather than peacetime assumptions. Milk, fresh where possible, powdered where necessary, was written into those standards as a non-negotiable component. This was not sentimentality. It was calculation. Commanders preparing for prolonged campaigns in Italy knew their troops would fight in mountains, endure wet winters, and carry heavy loads over broken terrain. Stress fractures, exhaustion, and slow recovery could derail entire offensives. The answer was not simply discipline or toughness. It was preparation, feeding men correctly before they broke. Leadership accepted a quiet truth. Victory depended on preserving strength, not just spending it. That philosophy contrasted sharply with earlier eras of warfare, where soldiers were often treated as expendable. In 1943, American leadership began to treat the soldier's body as a strategic asset, one worth protecting through planning and science. That decision would pay dividends when operations extended beyond their planned timelines. Angle 5, the enemy's decline. While American supply lines lengthened, German ones began to unravel. By 1943, Nazi Germany faced mounting agricultural and logistical crises. Millions of farm workers had been conscripted or killed. Allied bombing disrupted transportation networks critical to food distribution. Synthetic substitutes replaced real nutrients. Rations were reduced again and again. German soldiers increasingly suffered from weight loss, fatigue, and deficiency-related illnesses. Field reports and post-war medical analyses describe brittle bones, delayed wound healing, and weakened immune systems among Axis troops. Milk and dairy products became scarce luxuries, reserved for children or unavailable altogether. This disparity mattered. In prolonged engagements, American units could rotate, recover, and return. German units often could not. Illness removed men from the line as surely as bullets. Recovery took longer. Morale eroded as hunger became constant. The physical decline of the German soldier mirrored the strategic decline of the Reich itself. War at this stage was no longer symmetrical. One side replenished strength. The other consumed it without replacement. Angle 6, the moral dimension of sustenance. There was an unspoken moral consequence to America's approach. Feeding soldiers properly was not framed as kindness. It was framed as necessity. Yet the effect was humane. Men were less likely to be discarded by injury or illness. Bodies were not broken and abandoned at the same rate seen in earlier conflicts. Survival improved, not just from better weapons, but from better care. This approach reflected a broader American wartime philosophy. industrial capacity used to preserve life as much as to take it. Milk, in this sense, symbolized a system that sought to keep men whole long enough to end the war sooner. Not through sentiment, through efficiency. By mid-1943, the consequences of these choices were no longer theoretical. They would be tested in sustained combat, where endurance mattered more than spectacle, and where small physiological advantages accumulated into decisive outcomes. The moment of proof was approaching, when planning would collide with reality, and the quiet calculations behind nutrition would reveal their true weight. The test arrived not in a single explosion, but over weeks of grinding movement. In the summer of 1943, American forces pushed deeper into the Mediterranean War. North Africa was giving way to Sicily. From there, the Italian mainland loomed, mountainous, wet, unforgiving. This was not a campaign of rapid breakthroughs. It was a campaign of marching, digging, climbing, and holding under constant strain. Temperatures swung violently. Days baked soldiers in dust and heat. Nights chilled them through damp uniforms. Loads remained heavy. Casualties accumulated slowly, then suddenly. Yet amid the expected losses, medical officers noticed something unusual. American units were staying intact longer than anticipated. Marching columns covered distances that, on paper, should have broken them down. Reports from divisional surgeons noted lower than expected rates of stress fractures compared to earlier training cycles. Cases of nutritional collapse, once common in extended field operations, declined. Soldiers arrived at aid stations exhausted, but not depleted. Field hospitals, often set up in captured farm buildings or canvas tents, became measuring points. Wounded men receiving high-calorie, protein-rich diets, heavily supplemented with milk, regained strength faster than planners had predicted. Bone injury stabilized. Muscle repair accelerated. Infections remained dangerous, but recovery trajectories improved. These changes altered operational tempo. Units that might previously have required withdrawal for rest were kept in the line. Commanders could maintain pressure instead of pausing to rebuild shattered formations. Supply officers noted steadier consumption patterns, less emergency demand, fewer collapses requiring evacuation. None of this appeared dramatic in daily reports. There were no medals for bone density or nutrient absorption, but the accumulation mattered. Every soldier who stayed on his feet reduced the strain on replacements, transport, and training pipelines. Meanwhile, the contrast with enemy forces sharpened. Captured German prisoners were thinner. Medical examinations revealed signs of long-term undernourishment. Wounds healed slowly. Fatigue was visible. In the Italian terrain, where endurance mattered as much as firepower, this disparity became increasingly costly. American planners did not celebrate this advantage. They simply recorded it and continued feeding their men accordingly. Because the war was not won by one decisive day. It was won by sustaining strength long enough for the enemy's strength to fail. And by late 1943, the data was no longer anecdotal. It was measurable, documented, and impossible to ignore. By the final months of 1943, the effects of America's nutritional planning had become visible across entire theaters of war. The evidence was not found in speeches or headlines, but in after-action reports, hospital statistics, and logistical summaries compiled far from the front. In Sicily and southern Italy, U.S. Army medical units compared casualty patterns from earlier operations to current campaigns. Non-combat losses, illness, fatigue-related breakdowns, stress fractures had declined, not vanished, but reduced enough to change planning assumptions. Divisions could be kept in combat longer before rotation. Recovery timelines shortened. This had cascading effects. Transportation assets once reserved for medical evacuation were freed for ammunition and fuel. Training depots faced less pressure to push partially trained replacements into combat. Commanders gained flexibility. When a unit was ordered to advance, it could do so with confidence that its men would physically endure the strain. The Surgeon General's office compiled detailed analyses in 1943 and early 1944 linking adequate calcium and protein intake to skeletal resilience and wound recovery. Powdered milk consumption correlated with fewer severe bone complications among infantry units operating in mountainous terrain. Hospital wards reported improved outcomes in fracture healing compared to pre-war baselines. These were not isolated studies. They were part of a system-wide evaluation of human performance under combat conditions. At the same time, intelligence reports painted a starkly different picture of German forces. Food shortages deepened. Dairy production within the Reich collapsed under bombing, fuel shortages, and labor loss. Frontline rations became increasingly inadequate. German medical services struggled to compensate, relying on substitutes that could not replicate the nutritional value of milk. The result was a widening physiological gap. American soldiers, though exhausted, remained operational. German soldiers, though experienced, deteriorated over time. In prolonged engagements, the side that could replace strength faster gained the advantage. Attrition favored the better-fed army. By the end of 1943, this advantage had become embedded into Allied planning. Nutrition was treated as a force multiplier. Milk was no longer an experiment. It was policy. What began as a logistical solution had become a strategic constant. And as preparations began for even larger operations ahead, including the coming invasion of Western Europe, the lesson was clear. The quiet decisions made in warehouses and laboratories had shaped the battlefield long before the first landing craft touched shore. Those decisions would now echo beyond the fighting itself, leaving consequences that extended far past 1943 and into the future warfare. When the campaigns of 1943 settled into uneasy pauses, the United States Army took stock, not with triumph, but with calculation. The war was far from over, yet patterns had emerged clearly enough to influence everything that followed. Medical summaries compiled after the Italian campaigns revealed a sustained trend. American units experienced fewer long-term physical breakdowns relative to their size and time in combat. Stress fractures, once a major limiting factor in infantry endurance, declined as a proportion of total casualties. Recovery times for bone and soft tissue injuries shortened measurably. Hospital throughput improved. These outcomes were not attributed to a single cause, but nutrition appeared repeatedly in the data. Milk, in particular, was cited as a consistent element in successful dietary programs. The Surgeon General's office noted that soldiers receiving adequate dairy intake demonstrated improved skeletal resilience and metabolic stability during prolonged operations. For planners, this mattered deeply. Every man kept in the field reduced pressure on the training system back home. Training a replacement infantryman took months, time, instructors, equipment, and transport. Reducing avoidable attrition preserved not just manpower, but momentum. Units with experienced soldiers outperformed those constantly rebuilt from scratch. The contrast with German forces continued to sharpen. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed worsening food shortages. Dairy products were increasingly absent from German rations. Civilian consumption took priority when possible, leaving frontline troops undernourished. The cumulative effect was demoralizing and physically debilitating. By late 1943, American leadership recognized that the war's outcome would hinge on sustaining this advantage. Nutrition standards were reinforced, not relaxed. Milk production remained protected from civilian ration cuts. Powdered milk shipments continued even as shipping demands intensified. The war machine had learned something fundamental. Endurance could be engineered. And that lesson would shape not only the remaining years of the conflict, but the structure of military medicine and logistics long after the guns fell silent. The effects of America's nutritional foresight in 1943 extended well beyond immediate casualty numbers. Entire operational strategies were influenced by the simple fact that soldiers could now sustain longer campaigns without succumbing to preventable weakness. Division commanders adjusted marching schedules, rotational plans, and assault timelines with confidence that troops could endure what previously would have been prohibitive strain. Quartermasters documented efficiencies that seemed invisible at first glance. Reduced medical evacuations freed ships and trucks for munitions and fuel. Hospitals faced lower bed occupancy from non-combat ailments, allowing more focus on serious injuries. Supply officers could plan rations predictably, reducing waste and preventing shortages. The logistical system itself became more resilient. In Sicily and southern Italy, the human cost of battle was mitigated subtly but measurably. Men were less likely to be sidelined by fatigue or malnutrition. Units remained cohesive longer, preserving combat experience and leadership continuity. Operational tempo increased. Campaigns that could have dragged for months now moved faster, sustaining pressure on Axis forces already stretched thin. The lessons learned in 1943 did not vanish with victory. They were codified into U.S. military doctrine. Nutritional science became embedded in planning manuals. Powdered milk, high-protein rations, and vitamin supplements were standardized components of field kitchens. Military medicine incorporated diet as a critical therapeutic tool, influencing hospital procedures and rehabilitation practices. Beyond the military, these developments influenced civilian food policy. Wartime research into nutrition informed post-war school programs, public health campaigns, and agricultural planning. Milk, once an ordinary part of everyday life, was now recognized as a strategic element of national resilience, its significance validated by thousands of soldiers kept alive and effective during the most demanding campaigns of the war. By the end of 1943, it was clear the quiet calculations behind rations and supply had tangible consequences. They shaped battles, preserved lives, and set precedents that would last far beyond the conflict itself. A small, unassuming commodity, milk, had become a critical weapon in America's arsenal against Nazi Germany, proving that victory relied as much on human endurance as on bullets and bombs. War is often remembered through the smoke of gunfire, the roar of tanks, and the decisive clash of armies. Yet the campaigns of 1943 reveal another truth. Victory is as much about endurance as it is about firepower. Behind every maneuver, every landing, every breakthrough, lies a quieter, invisible struggle, keeping men alive, healthy, and capable of facing the enemy again and again. Milk, simple and unassuming, became a symbol of this struggle. Its calcium strengthened bones under relentless strain. Its protein fueled muscle recovery. Its vitamins defended against disease. Across the deserts of North Africa, the hills of Sicily, and the mountains of Italy, it allowed American soldiers to endure what might have otherwise broken them. It was not glamorous. It was not heroic in the traditional sense, but it was decisive. The careful planning, scientific foresight, and logistical coordination required to deliver it reflected a profound shift in the nature of warfare. Men were no longer treated as expendable. Their bodies were strategic assets. This philosophy, melding industry, medicine, and supply, transformed the U.S. military into a force capable of sustained global operations. By 1943, America had learned that battles were not won solely on the front lines. They were won in laboratories, in factories, in warehouses, and in mess tents. A warm cup of milk, consumed quietly before dawn, could ripple outward to shape the course of history. In the end, the story of 1943 reminds us that wars are fought not only with weapons, but with care, foresight, and the preservation of human life. In that calculus, even the smallest decisions, what men eat, how they're nourished, can determine the fate of nations.